Welcome to the Flower Lounge, a place for conversations with wildly creative people and a little plant-loving wisdom to help you experience life in full bloom. I'm Katie Hess, flower alchemist and founder of LOTUSWEI, and I believe in a world where we're all living at our personal edge. Welcome to the Flower Lounge this week. I am really excited to have this week's guest, a woman who came on my radar several years ago through this beautiful book that she wrote called The Honey Trail. And since then, I have been discovering a whole universe of interesting new things about Grace Pundyk. And so I'd like to introduce her. Dr. Grace Pundyk is a Melbourne-based multidisciplinary artist and writer. Her PhD research titled Invisible Words, the Semaphore of Skin, drew on the mediums of photography, video, installation, theater, and artifacts of skin to interrogate the intergenerational impact of the unspeakable traumas of a past war, and in response to the perceived limitations inherent to writing trauma. It is from this incredibly interesting research that Grace began making parchment, which she sources directly from marsupial roadkill in northwest Tasmania. Largely self-taught, in 2014, she undertook a mentorship with Pergamena, professional parchment makers in New York, and is currently developing a group exhibition of artists' work on her parchment. Grace describes her work as inhabiting a strange periphery, and she's performed, this is so good, she's performed in a giant bird's nest to the sound of birdsong, on a moving river barge at 4 a.m., amidst giant floating lotuses, and staged theater performances inside a freight car at a rail yard. Her books include the global travel narrative, The Honey Trail, and Sons of Sinbad, the photographs. Appearances at various festivals include 10 Days on the Island, the Melbourne Festival, White Night, and the Sydney and Brisbane Writers' Festivals. Her play, Step, A Journey of Unforgetting, premiered at the 2015 Melbourne Fringe Festival and was shortlisted for the Rodney Seaborn Playwrights Award in 2016 and was recently selected for the 5th International Women Playwrights Conference to be held in Santiago, Chile in 2018. So excited. You are doing so much amazing work, Grace. I can't wait to dig into all of it. Thank you for being here.
A big introduction.
So I wondered if I could do a little 15-second exercise with you. Okay, so it would be to close your eyes and go back to your childhood and think about a time when you played around flowers or plants or trees. And you just think about what you were doing and who you were with, and if you had a favorite flower or plant or tree. And if you could describe its personality in 3 words, just thinking about how you might describe it. And then you can open your eyes and just let me know what you were thinking about, what you were up to, what was your favorite, and the 3 words you would use to describe its personality.
So I have 2 favorite flowers, the rose and gardenia. And interestingly enough, when I just did that, you asked me to close my eyes and I went back to my childhood, I realized those 2 flowers are actually my mother's favourite flowers. And I'd never considered that ever before, because going back to my childhood, my strongest memory is not related to flowers. It's related to playing dress up at my grandmother's, spending time on my own. I love and have always loved being on my own and singing to the sky, watching the clouds. That's my strongest memory as a child. And so, and then I thought, but roses and gardenias are my absolute favourite flower. But when I just closed my eyes then, I thought, oh, my mother's favourite flower too. And I had this memory of her growing roses in the front yard of our garden, of our house, and finding gardenias. And I learned from her how fragile they were and that if you touched the petals, they would bruise really easily, and how much you had to treat them with such respect and gentleness. So, wow, that's a really interesting experience. Thank you for that. I just had not even considered that. I had made it my own, and I had made these flowers my own favourite flowers. But, yeah, that goes back to my mother.
Oh, so sweet. And if you were to, let's take both of them, first the rose, How would you describe the rose personality or the personality of the rose in 3 words?
I often think of rose as the Hindu goddess Durga.
Mm-hmm.
I think because of the thorns, I know not all roses have thorns, but the thorns are fearsome, and you have to be careful of them. And yet there's such a serene quality and a lusciousness to the actual flower. So Durga is one way I describe the rose. What are my other words for the rose? I think, lusciousness and heaven sent, as in SCENT, or it could be SENT. And gardenia, I think those 3 words, fragile, powerful, and precious.
Okay. Wow, that's exquisite. What we usually find is that the way you would describe your childhood flowers would describe precisely the unique way that you bring your gifts to the world. So you may be Durga-like and luscious and heaven sent from heaven and have a heavenly scent. Fragile, powerful, and precious. Does that resonate?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Often I feel quite fragile. But recognise that some of the messages that I think I portray in my work is quite powerful. And I think it's very much the preciousness is the gift. I think it's a gift. Wherever those creative ideas come from, that is a precious gift. I never feel that I can claim ownership to what I do. I feel like it comes through me. I'm being asked to do it, whether it's bees or the ghost of someone long gone. It's,
You know what? I find that often lately with creatives, and even I was just speaking to very well-known herbalist Rosemary Gladstar the other day, and she was saying, oh my God, she said, that tiny group of us herbalists that started this revival of herbalism in the West, she said, I don't think we did it, because we wanted to do it. She said, I think the plants called us to do it and they worked through us to get it done. And I think that's a really interesting perspective, and I hear that commonly among artists.
Yeah, I think it's a really important one to acknowledge as an artist as well, that, you take the I, the ego, out of the equation and be open to what is the message that needs to be told, what's the story that needs to be told, who is it that's speaking, and how do you articulate that voice, and in what way, what's the best way to carry that message through.
I do the same thing when I'm collecting flower essences. It's like, okay, what is here that everybody needs, and what's the language I need to use for that particular person who really needs it?
Yeah.
It sounds very similar to your process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How is your work, not just the honey trail,
Thank
but
you
all
for
of
reading
the
the book, by the way. I absolutely love it when people reach out and say, I've read your book and thank you. So for me, that is I just love it when people acknowledge that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I originally thought, oh, well, we definitely need to connect about, honey and flowers and bees and the, what's happening in the world with bees. But then when I saw all of this more recent work that you've been doing, I became fascinated, because I am also really interested right now in sort of like the emergence of ancient languages of like poetry and movement. And it seems to me like you're bringing in a lot of this new work like that as well.
Yeah.
So is there anything, before we dig into your more recent work, is there anything that we should be looking at in terms of really the distillation of the most important information from the honey trail that you think listeners would definitely want to know about?
Well, I guess one of the main reasons behind writing the book, I'm a traveller and I love honey and bees. So it seemed like this perfect combination to incorporate a journey, because the more I looked into bees and honey, the more I realised how universal they are. They continue to be, of course. But back then it was before it was sort of at the beginning of colony collapse disorder, and before it was becoming bees and honey were on everyone's radar. So that was quite timely as well in terms of going on the journey and researching it And rather than it being some sort of historical, sweet little narrative, the more I read about it, the more I realised also how much bees and honey reflect what's going on in the world in terms of globalisation. And globalisation, that's a really broad term, but, you know, deforestation, food issues, corporatisation of food, honey and bees, pesticides, GMO, villages being affected, you know, communities being affected. So it seemed like a really great opportunity to combine my curiosity, because I think that's what it is with travel. It's curiosity that compels me into a project, and this was definitely that. Like, what would I find? What would I uncover? But also having an openness, being open to opportunities, and not quite knowing when you travel, you never quite know what the adventure is going to be or how it's going to unfold. So it was a combination of going, I'm going to go on this journey, I'm going to write this book, let's see what happens and see what unfolds. So that was the journey of the honey book. But there was, it was a lot of stuff that happened after that that saw me having to let it go in a lot of ways.
How is your work driven by things that are either forgotten or long gone or precious or on the brink of extinction or maybe unheard? Like, can you talk a little bit more about how those elements weave into your work?
So I can talk about my current project, and maybe that will explain in a way that came about and how I've worked with that, all of that you've just asked. So my current project, which has been a 5-year, well, actually longer journey, but dedicated 5 years, the last 5 years I spent working on it, is based on my grandmother, my father's mother, who was Polish. So my father was Polish, and I didn't know her. She was never spoken about, or rarely spoken about. And when my father died in 2003, I found some letters in his belongings. There was only 4 letters and a handful of photographs, and they're packaged together. And they're written in Polish, so I don't understand that language. And I had them translated, and 3 of the letters were written by my grandmother, and the 4th was with a woman who had been with her and had survived. So these women were part of the numbers are only estimated between over 300,000 to 1.5 million Poles who were deported under Stalin to Siberia, Kazakhstan, to prisons and work camps in World War II. So my grandmother was one of those people, and she died in Siberia. So the 3 letters that my grandmother had written were to her husband, my grandfather, and I had the letters translated, and they were the saddest letters, Katie, for me, that I could read. I knew nothing of this history. I knew absolutely nothing of the trauma that had transpired or what had happened. I knew she died in Russia. You know, I knew that. And maybe as a child I knew not to ask. But when I found these letters, they really, I like to say that they possessed me. I became possessed and haunted by this woman's voice. So it became, this project was, how do I listen? What's her message? How can I even possibly know who this woman was when all I have are these 3 letters that she'd written and a handful of photographs that were predominantly, like one of them is of her in a coffin, you know, it's after she died. So they're all narratives of trauma. They're all artifacts of trauma. So how can I listen to this voice, this ghost of my grandmother, and express that in a way that is truthful and honours her memory? So it was a really challenging project for lots of reasons. I had to research what had happened to the mostly women and children who were deported. So that was pretty harrowing. But also at the same time, I had very little to go on. So I couldn't make assumptions. How could I assume who this woman was or what had happened to her? Because she also revealed very little in her letters. And I had only a handful of experiences where I felt like, so for a long time I really struggled with, I don't have permission to do this. Do you know, I have these items. So in a way I have permission, but I really struggled for quite a few years of, how can I tell this story and who am I to tell this story of this woman who lived in the last century, of a different geography, a different culture, a different time. And in a way, I felt like my father was the gatekeeper. He was like, I could hear his voice saying, this is my mother, you can't tell this story. So I was really conflicted for a long time I was haunted, but at the same time, what's the story that I tell? And then just a few things happened where I felt like really quite ghosty things happened, where I felt like she's giving me permission to do this. Like, I found a photo, one of the same photos that I have, I found online, and I thought maybe someone had copied the photo that I had because I'd put it in various forums and used it. But it was on a Polish newspaper website. And it was the very same photo of a whole group of mostly women and children in their camp, in their work camp. And I contacted the paper, and it was actually belonged to another woman who was still alive, and she'd been a child when she was deported. And it turned out that, there's like about, 40 people in this photograph, right? Mm-hmm. And I know where my grandmother is, like I can recognise her in the photo, and it turns out that the woman said, no, I don't remember your grandmother, but I'm standing next to her in the photo.
Oh,
my brother's
goodness.
Sitting on your grandmother's lap, and my mother's standing behind your grandmother. I know, right? So I just thought, she doesn't remember my grandmother, that doesn't matter. That's like a message from this, the other world, the other side, saying it's okay, thank you for remembering, and go forward. So there's a few little things like that happened. Wow. So again, about listening, being open to the stories, and not being like, I'm going to do this, this is the path I'm following, and I'm not going to diverge off that path. Being open to it. And I think that's the same thing with the Honey Trail. It's the same thing with a project that I'd done before that, as well as, yes, having an idea, but also being humble enough to go, well, that idea might change. And that's sometimes important, because we can't always tune into, I think there's a lot of stuff that happens around us that we can't see and we don't hear because of lots of, real world, this world distractions. But if we take our time to tune in, sometimes it gets through. So I think that's the main thing for me with my work. I don't know if that answers your question.
I love it. Yeah, wow, I love that. And so, just like, what would you say to the listeners who have, an idea for a project, or like a story they want to tell, or being able to channel ideas from a place that may not be so logical or rational? Do you have any advice or suggestions based on everything that you've been through to sort of allow these creative ideas to kind of come through versus control them?
I think that for a start, take the voice, the voice that says, no, I can't do that, or no, that's a silly trajectory to go down. I think that's really important to go, no, I'm going to just be open to consider all ideas that come in. So once you do that, then eventually they become filtered out, like ones that that you might want to work with. I think that's a really important thing, to not discount, as fanciful or as crazy as it might seem. Like for me, learning to skin marsupial roadkill from which I make parchment. I mean, really? As a way of expressing, one of the ways of expressing the trauma of these letters that I found. Where did that come from? But it was something that I ended up doing, which became a much bigger thing than just my grandmother, as my grandmother's story. So I think it's really important to just not discount ideas, and then sit with them for a while and, take notes or draw pictures or photographs or, whatever the material, be open to the medium that you might want to play with as well. Don't restrict yourself to one discipline as well, unless, that's your absolute calling, that, you just want to write. For me as a writer, that was one thing that I've just thought, no, I want to step outside of that. And, I've danced all my life as well. So some projects call for a different mode of expression. And it's just being open to that, I think, is really important.
Wow, I love that. Wow. Yeah, wow. I was just in Costa Rica for a couple of weeks, and I connected on the second week with some really close friends of mine, one who used to be a professional dancer and now she's working with like body wisdom through movement, another woman who's been a poet all her life. And it was so interesting to see, you know, someone in the group had the idea that why don't you move to her poetry? And so we went to the beach one day, and it was honestly like one of the most riveting, moving, like unbelievably profound connections I've ever seen between two people. And it like I told another friend of mine, like, oh my God, it's almost like I feel voyeuristic, because there was such a profound and electric connection that I was like, oh my God, should I really be seeing this? Because it's like
it was quite intimate.
So intimate, and that you know, one's work brought the other one's so much more alive. And so it occurred to me that there are these ancient languages that we speak that, let's say, we don't speak them, but we can recognize them. So like movement, poetry, creative expression, flowers, speaking to flowers, nature, like these are all languages that are, you know, ancient, that we can all have access to. We just are not engaging them in our daily lives. And what, you know, what an incredible richness if we were able to tap into that. So I'm curious, when you asked the question about your own work, how the heck did you get into skinning marsupial roadkill? I mean, like, and what marsupials? I don't even know if we have marsupials here. Like, is that?
I don't think so.
Like
I think
an Australian.
They're Australian. So it was mostly wallaby. So for a start, there's lots of, in the Southern Island state of Tasmania, there's loads of roadkill. And I have, if anyone's read my book, The Honey Trail, they'll know that I've spent a lot of time and was living in Tasmania at the time. So I have a memory of roadkill in Tassie. And for me, the memory is of these silent, peripheral, forgotten, slowly unidentified, decaying beasts and beings. So very much on the periphery, there's the road that, you know, people use to get from A to B, but then the animal gets killed and they're just left usually to the side of the road. So there was that. But in terms of the letters, so if we go back to my grandmother's letters, as artifacts, I couldn't read them because I don't understand Polish. So for me to look at them, so I was relying on translation. So the translations were a secondary source. So who knows how accurate in terms of, you know, language is so extraordinary in terms of translation. It was like, did the translator capture all of the nuances? I wasn't to know. So for me, it was really important to respond to the letters themselves, but I couldn't do that through reading. And, you know, as we can read and we can write. So I had to respond. I felt like I had to respond to them in a different way. So I was looking at them, and it's funny you talk about ancient languages, because looking at the letters and the way it was written, it was reminded me of hieroglyphs and, you know, ancient languages as well, because I couldn't understand any of the words. So it became like a pattern or something that was indecipherable. So I was thinking about ancient languages, and that also reminded me, this is a really long explanation about how I got to start working with skin, Katie. So just bear with me.
No, I love it. I think we need to know all the details.
So the other thing is, I had learned years ago that my surname Pundyk is actually ancient Aramaic for innkeeper. And I'd learned this. The Pundyk global diaspora is largely Jewish. I've learned that. So my father was not Jewish. We weren't brought up Jewish. But I have since learned that there's a huge Pundyk diaspora around the world who are Jewish. Mm-hmm. So this elderly Jewish gentleman in New York once told me that Pundyk was Aramaic for innkeeper. And that got me, years ago, I was really sort of researching the whole thing of Aramaic, which is a very ancient language, and learning about, it was a language that didn't have written vowels. Wow. And So I was thinking about that and my grandmother's letters, which were like hieroglyphs, and I couldn't understand them. But they were so infused with so much memory and silence. So I was, because of the ancient connection with ancient languages, that took me right back with and Aramaic. I was thinking of letters, not written like epistolary letters, but the alphabet letters. Yeah. And it got me to a letter, and it's also a concept of Aleph. So Aleph is sort of the precursor to A. Simply put, it's the precursor to the letter A, but it's also, as a concept, represents silence and the space in between and the invisible.
Wow.
And so I was sort of exploring all of this. And when I was playing around with the concept of Aleph and researching that, in a lot of the rabbinical texts, they talk about Aleph. And I was looking at the trajectory of how the letter A evolved, and going right back to, I think it was the Sumerians or the Phoenicians, the letter Aleph resembled an ox's head. So if you think of an ox's head, so there, if we turn it upside down, it becomes A, and this way. So there's the horns. I'm showing Katie.
So if the A flipped down to its side and the little legs stuck out to the left.
Well, these are the horns, and this is the face here, the face. Anyway, so I was thinking, wow, that's really interesting in terms of writing and the taming of language, because the writing becomes like a taming of language, and the idea of the ox is like this tamed beast. He was a beast of burden that worked. So that got me thinking about ancient manuscripts and parchment. Manuscripts were once made on skin, parchment, and often made with cow or sheep or goat. So that was when I started thinking, the letters that I've inherited are like skins of memory. And I'm thinking about skin as a conduit of memory, but also skin as an inheritance, family skin, and the whole idea of skin. So it was sort of all bubbling away in my head as I was thinking of these ideas and researching and going back into this concept of ancient languages. How do I articulate that which I can't understand, which also hasn't been written? Again, going back to my grandmother's letters, was so much that she didn't write about. So the gaps in between the words, the writing just failed to give enough information. And I thought, okay, maybe I can start making parchment. But then I thought, well, how am I going to do that? I don't want to just get sheepskin or cow from an abattoir. It just didn't seem ethically appropriate. And then I recalled that, well, also, how do I articulate this in my own temporal and geographical milieu, like my own location? I have no connection really with Poland. I didn't grow up with any memory of that, but I have a memory of my own Australian geography and how I connect with the land. So that reminded me of the amount of roadkill in Tassie, and I thought, it's similar to me. There was this similarity with, I consider what had happened to my grandmother and all of those people as people who existed on the periphery. They no longer, they had been taken away from their homes. They lost their identity, their status. They lost everything, and that they were abandoned in a lot of ways. And so there was this connection with, well, maybe I'll learn how to start making parchment. Of course, I didn't even know how to skin an animal. I can start doing that by doing it with roadkill. So there was a whole process I had to go around, like I had to get permission from various government departments in Tasmania to do that. And then Stuart, my partner, his father is from northwest Tasmania, and we have a saying in Australia, he's a bushie, like he grew up in the northwest and hunting and fishing and, all of that sort of stuff. So I asked him if he would teach me how to skin a wallaby, and he did. And so the two of us would go out looking for animals, and of course we wouldn't get horribly flattened ones, the ones that were just still whole. And it was quite extraordinary, Katie. It became, apart from the whole brutal practice, it became an engaging with the dead. I also began a ritual of burial So I would skin the animal. I would take it to a place in the bush. I'd skin the animal and bury it then, the carcass under, fern fronds or forest detritus, and it would often disappear the next day. So Tassie devils or feral cats would go and eat the carcass. So it was not like it was being used, and it was, going back into the environment.
It sounds more like a ceremony, though. That was the important part of it.
Absolutely ceremony. And I found myself, from the moment of finding the animal, I would engage in, it was not a dialogue because they weren't talking back to me, but I would continually talk to the animal, and I would notice, the moment of impact, what had killed the animal. I would mourn the animal, and even during that process of the skin. So again, it's like a dilution of memory, because you have the skin, but then the fur comes off, and there's a whole process that you have to go through. My experience, it became, again, would keep talking to the skin, and it's such a tactile, amazing material that I couldn't help but still feel the presence of the animal throughout that whole process. And also because, I have a memory of where I found the animals. So when I look at pieces of parchment that I have now, I still remember the location and what the animal was. And but the other thing that happened earlier on in the piece, the first time this happened that I'm about to tell you, I just thought, oh gosh, maybe that's just my mind processing this brutal process, but it continued to happen. So after I'd skinned the animal, it would appear in my dreams.
Wow.
For about 3 nights.
Whoa.
Yeah, and it would not be part of my dream. It would just be there on the side of the dream, just watching, and like the dream periphery.
Wow.
And I just thought, and I have become, for me, the way I understood it was like I had become responsible by connecting with that animal and taking its skin. I had then somehow become responsible, become connected. And so it was really important to also see that process through, like I really understood the richness of the practice and the extent of the importance of the ritual and what I was doing as well. So, yeah, that was my parchment program. And then there was a whole thing of like learning how to make it, it's a really hard process. Yeah, it's been an extraordinary journey, but that came out of one of the things that came out of this project, inheriting these letters.
Wow, that's fascinating. I think when I think about skin, I think about, if I think about it in terms of my own body, it's like something that breathes, like research has actually shown that our skin breathes and we take in information. And if we were sitting in the same room, I may be breathing in oxygen or I may be breathing in air that you've exhaled. So it's like this interesting interchange of inseparability or communication. And it seems like what you were doing just totally amplified that.
I think so, yeah. Like the ancients talk about the pneuma, the soul or the breath, and they often refer to the skin as the way it was, exactly what you just said, as the way it's shared. And I think that's probably what happened without me knowing that's, again, it was like I didn't know I had no understanding of what was going to happen or why. It was about just following these ideas wherever they were coming from and experiencing the encounter and going, I wonder if this is what this is, So, yeah, for me it was like, this is real. This is not just theorizing. This is actually real. Yeah.
Well, and we're talking about an actual sentient being. I mean, it's not something like a piece of paper. It's like like in my Tibetan Buddhist training, we always, like, if I see an animal dead and I'm driving down the road and if I see roadkill, I actually immediately say one of 2 different mantras for that animal as like a sign of compassion and also like, may they be liberated. And I think like the connection and the love and the compassion that you showed for the animals that you found, actually, we would believe that it would actually contribute to the benefit of that being. And
I hope so.
Pretty powerful.
Yeah, I hope so. I just feel like maybe because of those dreams and that sensation that I like to think so. Yeah.
And so how did you connect back that particular practice back to the work that you were doing, storytelling and sort of like accessing in the silences and the spaces an ancient language of what actually happened to your grandmother? How do you connect those two?
So I made one of the installations I did. So I had held an exhibition last year of the work that I created. And one of those actually contained pieces of parchment, and I called it phylactery, which is, again, Jewish, they're little boxes made out of leather or certain parts of, I think it's a bull, that the little boxes, and also they wind these threads, these leather threads around their arms. Anyway, I was playing around with the idea of memory wall and skin. And so I cut a lot of the pieces of parchment into small squares and threaded them with very, very fine Japanese silk thread. And that's also, there was a reason it was Japanese silk thread. Well, we maybe can back to that, but it was in relation to, I've recently become a grandmother and my grandson is half Japanese. So again, it was that connecting threads with family. So sort of the future, so the past was the Polish, the skin for me is the whole artifacts of memory, and then the threads, that Japanese connection was also really important, was honouring the next generation. And I just had printed a few lines on each piece of parchment from my grandmother's letters. So it wasn't really clear when you looked at it, what it was. It was really lovely to hear people's responses when they would go in. That some people knew what the exhibition was about and others didn't. But those who would come in, cold, so to speak, they'd look at it and they go, I know that this is something that's really this is really sad, or I'm thinking that this is about maybe domestic violence, or this is something that, like they were clearly picking up from the words. It was about this woman's story. So I selected certain lines from my grandmother's letters. Again, the translation, so they were in English. But, lines like, just imagine what I'd have done, and I'm so lucky to have such a good husband, and please remember me from time to time if you can, I beg you. Lines like that. So, and the piece itself was, because it was so fragile, it was so quite light, just being hung from this silk thread that also this tangles of thread fell to the floor. Any breeze would make the artwork tremor. So, and there were the shadows created. So there was this real ephemerality to the piece as well that for me spoke to shadows and ghosts and remembering and looking at not just the material piece that, but the movement, how that creates, like we don't see the wind, we don't see the breeze, but how this picked up and moved with the breeze. So that meant that the movement was different all the time. It wasn't sort of automated or generated through a machine. It was quite fluid. So that was, but there was also, like through me doing that practice with roadkill, I ended up doing a whole lot of photographic series of me actually just wearing a fur coat on the side of a road. So I really became tuned into the periphery and the animals that we don't see on the side of the road. So there was a whole photographic series that I did as well in relation to that.
Okay, so there's so many questions that are popping up in my mind, so I want to
great.
grab these little threads before they disappear. Okay. One thing I think is so interesting is, how let's see. So when I was studying flower essences, one of my teachers would say, we carry in our cellular makeup and in our DNA up to 6 generations back of messaging or voices in our generation, like in our, family history. So like you may have a thought or I may have a thought. I think it's very unique to me, but actually it's something my grandmother thought or my great-grandfather thought. And it's just kind of cycling through. And so I wanted to ask you, in your work and in this exploration, how are we directly a product of our ancestors' past or of our ancestors? And how does that come through? And how did it address perhaps wounds in you that wanted to be healed? Like, someone may say like, oh, wow, this sounds very like depressing, but I could also imagine that it's a vehicle for healing and transformation as well. And if that came through the project for you.
Absolutely did. As difficult as it was a necessary thing to do. And one thing I really struggled with for a long time while doing this project was recognizing that I am a product of that history. If that didn't happen, my father would never have been a refugee to Australia. He would never have come to Australia. My brother and I simply wouldn't have existed because, he would never have met my mother and all that sort of stuff. So acknowledging that. So for a long time, I really struggled with that. It really depressed me, and I was quite traumatized because I felt that it was hard to celebrate that, coming from a history that was so sad. But now I don't see it like that. Now I see it as, even though my grandmother didn't survive, I'm a continuation of that. So I have survived. And in honouring her memory and knowing now, I don't know her story. I know some of her story, but I feel like there has been, an acknowledgement from the dead. So there's been a healing in that way, because for a long time I see that, these letters had been hidden away. So for me, I saw that as her spirit, her memory being hidden away. And of course, you've got to remember that she died in Siberia with no family. She just died with, a group of women around her, which is interesting in itself. And so I feel like it's part of this unexpected, and for her too, unexpected journey of healing, that she didn't have a happy family life, in the last however many years it was she was last. I don't know how long she was in Siberia for. She lost her husband, she lost her son, she lost her home, she lost everything about herself. Yet at the same time, in remembering her, in finding these letters, in working with her memory, in really going deeply into the responsibility of remembering and how best to witness. How do you witness something that you have no memory of? I feel like that's healed her, and I feel like she is now a part of me. She was always a part of me, but I feel like I brought her really in to the fold and said, welcome to the family, in the making that I've done with the works that I've created, but also in just being with this, living with this ghost and these wounded woman, because that's what it is, and me as a woman, because the next generation of woman that inherits, I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge too, that, she had her son, and then there were she didn't have any daughters. So there's me as a woman. I understand. There's so much I can understand. So in terms of that intergenerational and ancestor understanding, it's been a huge healing, because I'm the one that's alive now. And so I also understand that in doing that, I've been able to make sense of the decisions that I've made in the past in terms of my relationships. I've been able to understand perhaps, certainly how my father's behaviour, how that was, informed by what I believed was sort of a buried mourning. He didn't mourn properly. And so if anything, Katie, I just feel so much more grounded and whole. And I think that's because I've acknowledged my grandmother, who was so missing from my life, in this crazy way. Because I also have her name as my middle name. So in a way, and I've only just recently realised that too, that I've actually carried her memory unwittingly all my life. So, yeah, so I think it's important. It's being holistic, acknowledging our ancestors have made us.
It's interesting, because in energetic medicine studies, I would consider that, past, present, and future are in some ways pretty seamless, and that if I heal something very actively within my psyche, within my body, within the different, many different bodies, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical bodies, that it is said that it simultaneously heals that in generations up and down. So, thinking, how cool is that if we devote ourselves, no matter what practice it is, whether it's meditation or flower essences or artistic or creative expression or discovery of our ancestors, that when we heal something within ourselves. It may heal something in our mother, our grandmother, and in our children and our children's children. And could it be that simultaneously through this project, you have liberated just like that without doing anything to your grandchildren, you've liberated some sort of pattern or increased the capacity for more joy because of your work? What do you think about that?
I completely agree with what you're saying. I think it's really quite extraordinary how that works and that it can function on that level. And, I think about, really, I have, there's my brother and then my son, who are the family members, and both men who haven't been that interested or shown that much interest in what I've been doing. And I find that really interesting. But I think when they have seen what I've done and when I have told them a lot of the stuff I've told them, they've taken it on board. And I think there has been transformation in terms of, the living. But yeah, absolutely. I can't explain it. I just feel like it's clearer. There's been a healing. Mm-hmm. There's been a healing that's not just within me. It's quite profound. And as you say, you it's sort of the past and the future and the present is all connected.
And we don't necessarily need to know how or why. It's just a knowingness that in you that it's real because you feel it. Yeah. You feel it in your own body, right? So I wonder, how can we use our creative expression or anything that we're interested in terms of like the listeners listening? What would be or any sort of advice or recommendations for using or tapping into creativity to heal our own stories or our ancestors' stories? But let's just keep it really simple and say our own stories of trauma or challenge or grief in our own lives, and use whatever forms of expression that we can to transform it into something beautiful and healing. What would you recommend? It seems to me like you can take something very traumatic and, hard and grief-filled on one level, but as you work with it creatively, it becomes an expression of incredible beauty and depth and healing.
I think to make something, excuse me, is so important. And that making can be anything. It could be a written piece or a dance piece or a work of art or a teaching or a class that you do. But we are making something, and in that making, we share it with others. And maybe the sharing doesn't happen straight away, because the making is a process of being with that story for a while. So I think the making is the process of when we're in that story, what is the story that we want to tell and how do we want to tell it? But ultimately, well, I don't know. Everyone's different, Maybe you don't have to share it. For me, I think it's really important to ultimately important to share what I make, because even though for instance, this particular project was such a personal project, in the sharing, in the way I have created, all of the stuff that I've created, whether it's installation or video or, a play or whatever, it's connected to others, and other people, it's resonated for them in their own way.
Right.
And so I think what's important with our stories is recognizing, and I think this is part of the healing too, is recognizing, as personal and perhaps as sometimes as shameful as they might be, that we can't own them or we can't articulate them because they are so deep and troubling, that actually we find ways of sharing, and we find that it connects with others on it's a much deeper level and a universal level. Yeah. Are you going to say something? It's like, I got to say something.
It just like seems like so many dots are connecting. So you have two things that you're talking about, making and sharing. So the first process is making, right? And you said you're being with the story, you're being with the material. And I think about my Buddhist training and I think about meditation, and I think about a phrase that I often remind myself of, which is that the observation is the dissolution. So, like, for example, if I have a really intense, heartbreaking situation, that the knowingness of this, that all I really have to do is be aware of it, be with it, observe it. There's nothing I have to fix or figure out or force out or stop, or it's more just like being with it, being with it, being with it. And so from listening to you speak, I think, wow, this just making process helps us be with things so that the emotional intensity around it, some of that emotional intensity can dissolve and be freed up within our system. And then when we share, when you're talking about like the universality of something, obviously you have the threads that are very specific to your story, but it's almost like the sharing in that universality is another layer of freedom from whatever the intensity is of that, sort of heartbreak or situation. It's like in the sharing of it, in the human connection, it's like something else is liberated, something else is seen or witnessed in a different way.
Absolutely. And that's why we don't sort of make something precious and say, this is my experience and it's completely separate to everyone else's experience. It's I believe, in the making and then in the sharing, it becomes others' experience, and that way there's also healing can happen, and you see that in theatre a lot of the time as well, where an audience witnesses a story through theatre and it becomes their experience, but where are the origins of that story and how many times is it told and what do people take away from that seeing that piece of theatre?
So how do you take something that you've made? So I'll just use a personal example. I have a book of poetry. So earlier in the year, I had this really, really intense heartbreak situation.
Oh, sorry.
And no, it was actually very beautiful and like one of the most wonderful things that could have happened. I'm very grateful for it. But I have this like book of poetry. So how do you take something that's very, very specific, very personal, very, me, sort of my experience? How do you transition that into something more universal so that it can be, the most beneficial for others versus just sort of like a self-indulgent, this is all about me and my story sort of thing? How do you reach people's hearts and really truly make something transformative?
Well, it could be that the poems themselves are enough that they don't need to change, or it could be that we don't have to share. It could be enough that you've created this little book of poetry or big book of poetry, I don't know, it might be really long, and that might be enough. But I don't know, I always believe when we make something, it is for an audience. We always have something in mind. It could be that, you might want to collaborate with other people. How do they see it and how do they interpret what they get from the words that you've written or the feelings that arise? So a collaboration is one way of doing that in terms of the sharing. And it doesn't have to be on a big scale. It can be on a small scale, like you talked about your friends and witnessing the dance with the poetry, and that in itself can be enough. It's who do you want to work with? Who do you want to share your work with as well? For me, this latest project was important to share it with a largely unknown audience, ultimately, partly because the story itself, the history of this story is not known. We know a certain narrative of World War II, of the Holocaust and maybe the Japanese, but what happened to a lot of the people deported under Stalin is not known. So for me, that was another important reason to share the story, because I had recognized that even growing up as a child, I was part of that not knowing, that suppression of a history, which was not just a personal family thing, it was a social and political silencing. So my choice to write a play, one of the other things I did about this woman, my grandmother, but it wasn't my grandmother in the play, was important to share it to a wider audience so they knew about this particular part of history. So again, it's just deciding who is your audience, who do you want your audience to be, or what's the feeling when you read your own work. What other sensations do you get, or colours, or, for me with these letters, I was getting lots of visual cues. So I also realised that maybe writing was not the medium. There was another way of channeling this that I had to play around with, Yeah. So you're disengaging, I guess, from the I to look at the work itself. So you've got your poems. They're no longer about you. They're written. They're documented, and they become other. So then when you read them as other, maybe it's easier for other people to read them because they're not so personally connected, but what then do they get from it, and what's the sensations that they get from it? I think that's what I would do.
Wow. And do you have any advice for anyone who may be listening who has silenced a story, whether by their own volition or by, say, is something that happened in their family that maybe their family is suppressing it and doesn't want it spoken? Any sort of difficulty or challenge. Do you have any advice for storytelling on that level for stories that have been suppressed or silenced?
I think it's really challenging. For me, in a way, as difficult as this particular story was, and I talked about earlier on about feeling like I had to go beyond my gatekeeper father, who had died in 2003, and yet I still had his voice like, you can't do this. I think where families are concerned, it is challenging, especially if family members are still alive. That can be really confronting. So, with this, I think it was quite timely, and I think it was no coincidence that I found the letters. I think it was no coincidence that my father had hung on to them and probably didn't intend. Maybe he, not consciously intended them as an inheritance. But for others, look, what is that silence? I think, what is it that, how does it make you feel? It doesn't have to be maybe explicit. You don't have to bear warts and all the story. Perhaps that's also really important, is being sensitive to the environment, and that's not just place but people around you. And what are the other ways that it can be articulated rather than just, verbally or name and shame, or, finding that creative, that tuning into that creative voice that allows you to articulate it in a way that heals you. I think that's really important. What is it that you need to do?
And then just for like nuts and bolts, like if you had sort of a bullet list of, let's say, like a toolkit of things that a person could go to tell a story, say one being poetry, one being movement, like what would be some other sort of nitty-gritty ways that people could tell stories?
Photography. There's lots of ways of doing installations, that we have access to all sorts of material around us. If we sort of look at around our homes, I'm just looking at my room at the moment, and it's absolutely filled with all sorts of things that all have a story that are connected to me. So if I could take those elements and put them together in some way through, it could be even just through a yoga practice or meditation, or talking in the neighborhood, that like talking to your neighbors or chatting to people, listening to their stories as well, and finding others that you can tell your story to. There's lots of ways of communicating and finding ways. It doesn't have to be one particular discipline, or we don't have to, I think so often there's this focus of art and creativity as something that others can do, and it's like, oh no, I have to maybe train, or I don't have those skills. It's I think that's not necessarily true. So again, tuning in to what it is and how you want to articulate it.
You don't have to be a poet to write a book of poetry. You don't have to be a musician to put together a music playlist. You don't have to be a painter to do in a watercolor series, right? It's like
absolutely
languages that are accessible to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so One of my last questions is what kind of advice would you give to help us open up our capacity to invisible forces in terms of storytelling, creative expression, or just openness in general to invisible forces, to creating magic in our lives? Directionality of projects or lifestyle or where we're going. How do we open up to beautiful invisible forces?
Yeah, it's an interesting question too, because we're so often disconnected. We're so often outward focused. We're thinking, we don't often tune in. Mm-hmm. We're so often looking out and thinking out and projecting out. And I think, I think maybe for some people it comes easier than others. I've been teaching yoga all this year. Finally, I've been practicing for like a long time, and I finally started teaching. And one of the things I ask of my students is to take time to tune in, like they're using the physical asana, but as well as, breath, but take time to tune in to what's going on inside them. And that can be anything. It's not, maybe I get them to focus on their breath, of course. That's the first thing. But then also I do a little exercise with them where I ask them to tune into all of the sounds around them as well, and then bring those into themselves. And I just think that's a little exercise where I know that my students have responded in a way where, they'll talk about colours that they see, or they talk about a memory that they have that comes up. And I think, and that happens, it's not because I'm giving that to them, it's giving them the tools to go, this is how I can tune out the outward focus and be sensitive enough to catch a glimpse, because sometimes it is only a glimpse of something else. And I think that's a place to start. Mm-hmm. I think that's a place to start of how we can do that, how we can find that silence, and what is that silence saying.
Love it. Yeah, it's like the emptiness is not empty, the silence is not silent.
Oh no, not at all. So rich.
Wow, I could talk to you for hours.
Yeah, you too, Kate. It's been really fun.
What is the best way that people can explore your work? How can they find you?
I'm really bad at self-promotion. I've got a website, but as you know, it's not major. It's just like a whole lot of my photos and some of the things that I've done on that hopefully will be updated. I'm currently working on publishing. I'm hoping in the next couple of years publishing this latest work about my grandmother, Invisible Words, The Semaphore of Skin. That's the written component of it. The play I'm looking at, which also came out of that death, A Journey of Unforgetting, I'm getting it translated at the moment into Polish and Spanish, which is really exciting. And yeah, look, I don't know, how do people find me? I'm sort of quite invisible in terms of social media, and not social media, but, putting myself out there.
You're not on Instagram.
No.
Even though you have amazing photography and it would do
should. I know. People keep saying you should do Instagram. It's like, I should. Okay, that's on my list to do.
In the meantime, why don't you share your website?
Okay, it's just www.gracepundyk.com.
And last name is spelled Pundyk.
Yeah, right? That's right. Yep.
Well, I'm really looking forward to your Instagram account, because I just can't wait to see your photos.
Yeah, that's on the list. Yeah. Hopefully by the end of this year, I'll have an Instagram account. I'll have my website fixed up, and, links to the book, The Honey Trail, and Sons of Sinbad, the photographs, and other, links to all of my work. Yes.
Oh my gosh, it's so easy. You could go on Instagram right now and get your handle, your name, which probably no one else has.
Yeah.
And that could be ready, like by the time we'll let people know, just in
by
case.
Lunchtime today.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to set myself that task. I'll let you know.
Wow, such a pleasure. And if you ever come to the States to, maybe to New York City to perform some pieces of interesting work, please let us know.
I will. I'd love to. Thank you, Katie. It's been such a treat to speak with you, and I thank you so much for reaching out. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks for your beautiful work.
Thank you so much for listening to The Flower Lounge. I'm Katie Hess, and we'll be releasing a new podcast every Wednesday. If you like what you heard, or you know someone who might be touched by our conversation, share it with them. And don't forget to subscribe. To find out what your favorite flowers mean about you, take the quiz at LOTUSWEI.com.